So hello everyone, thanks for joining us again this morning. So EcoResolution is currently exploring our relationship with nature and how the psychological separation between our lives and the natural world is impacting our health of the planet and the people, and how this story of separation lies at the heart of our climate and ecological crisis. So today we're joined by Richard Louv, who's a journalist and author of 10 books, including Our Wild Calling, How Connecting with Animals Can Transform Our Lives and Save Theirs, Last Child in the Woods, The Nature Principle, and Vitamin N. His books have been translated and published into 24 countries and helped launch an international movement to connect children, families, and communities to nature. He was the first person to introduce the concept of nature deficit disorder and now speaks internationally about the importance of children's and adults' exposure to nature for their health and on the need for the environmental protection and preservation for greater access to nature and the health of the earth. So thank you so much for joining me today, Richard.
Thank you.
I'd love to just start by talking to you a bit about the book that maybe was the most important of everything you've written, or maybe the most well known, The Last Child in the Woods, which introduced this concept of nature deficit disorder. And what inspired you to write that book?
Well, actually, I was a kid once, and I spent much of my boyhood in the woods we lived on the edge of the suburban area of Kansas City, Missouri. I spent much of my boyhood in the woods with my dog. My parents often did not know where I was, but my dog always did. Mm-hmm. And I found something large there. I found something that stayed with me for my whole life. And I didn't know at the time that it would stay in that way and then come out later in this way. And later, as a journalist, I was covering environmental issues and all kinds of trends, and one of them was this massive disconnect between children all over the world. Not in all areas of the world, but certainly anywhere where there's any urbanization, there is a growing disconnect between children and nature. And I couldn't stand that idea because nature had been so important for me as a kid. So that's where that inspiration came from.
Mm. And what was the context that you found yourself in professionally at that time? So you were a journalist. Were you exploring a lot of the scientific things behind this idea of our disconnection from nature, or were you more interested in like the more kind of systemic and educational and like emotional attachments to nature? What was your exploration?
I think all of the above. And as the 4 books progressed, I got deeper and deeper into all of that.
Mm. And what exactly, if you were to define the concept of nature deficit disorder?
Well, it's not a known medical diagnosis. I always make that clear. But it is a way to talk about this thing that, at least then, in 2005, when Last Child in the Woods came out, people felt this, but they didn't have a language to talk about it. Parents felt it about their kids. Kids that I interviewed even felt it. They would watch television and see these old shows like Lassie and think that one kid told me that seemed like on another planet where kids actually went outside and spent a lot of time in the woods and fields and along creeks. One little boy told me that the reason he preferred playing indoors is because that's where all the electrical outlets were. Now, that was before we took so many devices outside with us. So it really is the effect of that disconnect also. Around that time in 2005, I could find, when I wrote Last Child in the Woods, I could find about 60 studies that I could cite in the book that showed both the disconnect, but more importantly, the benefits, the psychological benefits, physical health benefits, the cognitive functioning, our ability to learn and create. All of that is deeply affected by our connection to nature, whether we're kids or whether we're adults. that was an extraordinarily low number. Why were...
Sorry.
Is that a cat?
No, it was just a huge gust of wind, all the papers everywhere.
There goes nature again.
Yeah.
When I first started writing about this had been virtually ignored by the academic world. There were actually relatively very few studies on something so large as how the exposure to the to the natural world affects child development, affects adult development throughout our lives. There's hardly anything. Now, since then, since the book was published, the Children in Nature Network, which is a nonprofit that grew out of Last Child in the Woods, has a place you can go on the internet, and anybody in the world can go look at abstracts of the majority of the studies now that have been done on this question. And now there's over 1,000 in about 15 years, I think. And it's growing quickly. We get about 15 or 20 studies from somewhere in the world coming in on this. So it's now kind of a growth industry to study this issue.
And what do you think it is? Is it the immersion into the variety of stimuli and connections that are sent off when we're in nature, that it's like where we are supposed to be and where we thrive as human beings, animals, and that ability to connect with something much greater than like our immediate sense of identity and self? I think it's quite interesting that in our hyper-connected world in the virtual age, it's full of connections like social media, computerized technology. It's all built on the same kind of building blocks of connection, in theory, that we get through human relationships. But it's not the same. And I wonder if you've done research into this as well. Like, what's the difference between these virtual communities and physical communities? Like, what is it that we can get out of relationships in the real natural environment to virtual relationships and connections?
Well, first, I want to make clear I'm not anti-tech, particularly lately, with the pandemic, and Zoom is a good thing. So I'm not anti-tech, but there's a kind of formula that runs throughout my books, which is the more high-tech our lives become, the more nature we need. It's a budgeting issue of time and money for families, for communities, for individuals. What I mean by that is that we're going to be more high-tech, whether we like it or not. We need nature that is reality, that is an exposure to the world that is not made by humans. We need direct exposure to that as a balancing agent. Neurologically, we have to have that. It turns out that the burnout that we feel when we've worked too long at the computer, the best way to reverse that is to go outside in nature and pay a different kind of attention. And the studies that have been done on this show that immediately we're kind of renewed. Our neurological pathways are renewed when we are exposed to nature. Now, why that is true, I think has something to do with our senses. The people who study the human senses no longer talk about 5 human senses. They talk about, conservatively, around 9 or 10 human senses. And some of the people who study the human senses say that we have as many as 30 or more.
Wow.
senses. And they all have names, and they're really interesting. We have some of the ability of bats to use echolocation to find our way around in the dark. And there are quite a few other senses. Much of our day, we spend purposefully blocking out as many of those senses as we can to do what you and I are doing. To a sense of sound, sense of sight. All those other senses are shoved aside. And the more we create educational and living circumstances in which we're spending so much energy turning off as many senses as we can so that we can do this more. To me, that's the very definition of being less alive. Now, what parent wants their child to be less alive? Who among us really wants to be less alive. That is not being anti-tech to say that. That's saying that we are going to be more high-tech and we're going to need more nature around us to balance that. One of the theories as to why this is true several years ago was developed by E.O. Wilson, the great entomologist at Harvard. And he talked about what he called the biophilia hypothesis. Biophilia is love of life. And what he meant by the biophilia hypothesis is that human beings have an inherent attraction, a genetically programmed attraction to the rest of nature, an affiliation with it. Mm-hmm. And when we don't get that, we don't do so well. So this is our natural state. And biologically, we've not changed that much in an evolutionary sense. We still need nature as much as our ancestors did 20,000 years ago.
Yeah. It's really interesting what you were talking about, sensory attunement and awareness. And it makes me think about a lot of the kind of mindfulness practices that are very popular at the moment, and the role of sensory awareness in a lot of like meditation and things, and helping you to access like a deeper state of being. And it reminds me of when you're in a natural environment, you can really connect to that greater sense of peace in a similar way to when you are meditating or doing some deep breathing exercises or working with your hearing or something. And I think it just makes what you were just saying have even more importance, just this fact of like really moving beyond our visual, mental capacity that we're using so much, particularly at the moment.
Yeah, and this is particularly felt deeply during the coronavirus pandemic. What's happening now is really interesting to those of us who have been working on this issue for a long time. All of a sudden, nature has been taken away from people, access to it. In the United States, at least right now, most of the parks are still closed down. We're indoors, we're pulling inward because of the virus. Sometimes you don't know what you've got until it's gone. Mm-hmm. And you hear people talking about, media has picked up on this. I get interviewed a lot lately, more than usual, mm-hmm. because people feel this deeply. They feel disconnected, and they intuitively know that a connection to nature, and that can be the tree outside your window. It can still be in your yard or on your rooftop. It can be in the window from your high rise to another high rise from your apartment when you watch the raptor, the hawk on the ledge of a windowsill, building a nest, and you become mesmerized by that. Mm. That does something to you. You can feel what that does to us. And we particularly feel that when we can't have it. So I'm hoping that this awakens people to a couple things. First off, it awakens them even more to our absolute need for a connection to nature. I hope it awakens them to the inequity of access to nature. You live in some neighborhoods, certainly in the United States. I'm sure this is true around the world. And a lot of this depends on economics, particularly if you live in an urban area. And as of 2008, more people in the world live in cities than in the countryside. If you have money, it's easier to connect with nature if you choose to. There are more in the United States. There's a real inequity of distribution of urban parks, for example. I think this is making us more aware of that inequity. Mm. After the pandemic, we have to address that. After the pandemic, I hope, because of our growing awareness, we'll actually begin to increase the amount of wilderness areas. There's a slogan in The Nature Principle, which is the second of these two books, which is conservation is no longer enough. Now we need to create nature. as strange as that sounds, we need new kinds of cities. I believe that cities can be engines of biodiversity, not just the enemy of nature. And there's a lot of new design theories that are out there, and a lot of people working in biophilic design that are designing new kinds of buildings that have nature woven into them and kept in them. And they're finding that when those are workplaces or schools, the people are far more productive, sick time goes down, turnover gets better. And it's because of the presence of some kind of natural environment in the workplace or the school. Yeah. What if whole cities could be that way?
Yeah. I came across this book recently called Resilience by Stephen Southwick and Dennis Charney. Have you come across it?
I've heard of it, yes.
Yeah.
I should have read it.
Yeah, because I always think nature connection and time in nature is like a key building block to having resilience, like what we've just been talking about. Yeah. But what was quite cool in that book is that they interviewed many, many different people. And one of the key traits that came out from all the conversations was flexibility. And that was their defining characteristic, was their ability to be flexible when faced with challenge. And also, by the way, how they react emotionally to stressful circumstances. And it made me think a lot about relationship to nature, which often you have to be so flexible. You can't control your environment, and an ability to understand and move with realities that are much greater than yourself. It's like if you're canoeing, the weather changes, you get caught in a tide, you capsize, whatever, like you have no control on your environment and you are innately flexible. It just made me think a lot about this like concept of resilience, flexibility, and being able to cope. And I wonder if you have any other thoughts on like resilience and nature and connection.
Well, first, sounds like I better read that book. It sounds good, and I agree with that. Recently, I wrote a blog post, and I quoted a young woman who has been active in this movement, and she was sitting on a hill when she was writing this, looking out at her favorite view. This was kind of her sit spot, the place she went in nature to feel centered. And she had just graduated from college, and she didn't know what she was going to do next. And she went to her sit spot in her favorite view in nature. And she said she oddly felt this sense of stability when she was there. I thought that's really interesting. I've not heard that word used with being in nature, because in a way it's saying the opposite of what you're talking about, but I think it's really deeply saying the same thing, which is nature goes on, nature survives. It's one of the reasons in this pandemic people are getting comfort from nature. It tells us that life goes on. There's another aspect to this that I think I've been focused on recently. The most recent book came out last November. It's available in a couple languages, or going to be soon, and I hope many languages after that. And the book is called Our Wild Calling. And it's about how connecting to animals, wild animals, but also domestic animals or pets, can transform us and help us save them, help us save wildlife. And I'll just tell a story, a couple of brief stories. One is I met a woman who had a young son, a 6-year-old son in Canada, and they had a big dog named Jack. And one time she came into the living room and she saw that her son was stretched out on the floor with their dog, with his arm around their dog, stretched out. And she heard her son say, "Mommy, I don't have a hat. Mommy, I don't have a heart anymore." And she says, "What are you saying?" And her son said, "My heart is in Jack." Jack was the dog. And that sense of permeability we sometimes feel with a member of another species. We feel it with our own species too, but we also feel that with other than human species. What is that? that's the question of the book. I was on a lake once in my boat that has a very quiet electric motor, and I saw on the shore what I thought were two vultures. And I eased up very quietly to the big birds. And I got within about 20 feet, and I realized that those are not vultures. Those were two giant golden eagles. And I stayed there. And for about the next, I don't know how long, it seemed like forever. And that has something to do with what I'm about to say. We had eye contact. And for what seemed like forever, they would go down and take a bite of the fish they were eating off the shore and look up at me. And then go down and take another bite and look up at me. It went on forever, and it felt like something changed between us somewhere. I went home and told my son, who was home from college, about that. And I said, Matthew, whoever I say I am, I'm not. Whoever I was in those moments with the eagles is actually who I am. And I don't have the language to describe that. This is beyond human verbal language. In the book, I call that the habitat of the heart. I think there are two basic habitats. There's the physical habitat that we live in, and then there's this thing between us, that without this, we really don't exist. That thing between us, we neglect. That habitat. So there are two habitats. One is the physical habitat. We pay a lot of attention to preserving and protecting that, as we should. We spend very little time protecting and valuing the habitat of the heart, which exists between us and other life. And that's what this book is about. And I think that has a lot to do with the future of environmentalism. Environmentalism is not just about data. Fighting climate change is not just about scientific studies. As important as those are, they're essential. It's environmentalism, our love for the world, is not just about data. It is also about love. The great social movements that have succeeded, that have not been blocked. Climate change has been blocked. We're not nearly as far ahead on that as we should be on the climate challenge.
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons for that is we think that data alone will change minds. It won't. The great social movements that have moved people from data to action are the social movements, as Glenn Albrecht in Australia says, the great eco-philosopher, the great movements, whether it's gay rights or civil rights or feminism, have all been motivated by love. And that's the only thing that moves us beyond to take the next step once the data is in, once the science is in.
Yeah,
I think environmentalism has to rediscover that in some way. And the place to begin is in our relationship with the nature around us right now, with the wild animal that goes through our property that we have eye contact with.
Yeah, because you can only fight for what you love. Otherwise, it's never going to really be, you're never going to care enough to really fight for it unless you can really love it.
Yeah.
And I do agree that statistics and facts and data get in the way of having a deeper connection with something, especially when it's something that's so real and connected to all life, such as the mass extinction of species or biodiversity loss, or the horrific human rights injustices that are happening around the globe. If you're not connected to it, you can't really deeply fight for it.
No, when we intellectualize nature in a way, we kill it. And I want to make clear, I'm not saying either or. We need more science on this, but we can't depend on science to change minds or change hearts. Eventually, we have to have this be an emotional connection. That's one of the reasons why Greta, the young woman who has made such an impact on the world, is making that impact. She's not reading off lists of statistics. she's talking deeply from her heart, emotionally, about this loss. And we need, I think we need to deepen that even more, and we can deepen that most readily through our connection right now to the nature around us.
Mm. Yeah, I read that in your book, you talk a lot about empathy in your most recent book. Is that it behind you, Our Wild Calling?
Yes, strategically placed.
No, great. Thank you for doing that. Well, you talk about empathy. Is that the connection you're talking about, the heart connection, or is empathy something different?
Well, it is the habitat of the heart. I mean, it's a short form way of saying that, but I think by calling it the habitat of the heart, you see the fullness more than the simple word of empathy. But empathy is absolutely required. And I know that some of this may verge to some people as anthropomorphism, projecting human qualities onto other animals. I think that the cutting edge wildlife biologists that I've interviewed and scientists, they're not rejecting anthropomorphism has become a taboo to the point where people began to think that animals didn't have emotions, didn't have those kind of qualities, and didn't have intelligence. Well, now because of the science, we know that they have a lot more emotion and a lot more intelligence than we think. Mm. And there's a fellow who's a herpetologist and naturalist and a psychologist who talks about something called it's a kind of anthropomorphism. It's practical anthropomorphism, in which he says if you're going to study a snake, you have to be with the snake. You have to sit with the snake. You have to use all of your senses to try to understand how that snake is sensing the world. He says it's 2 steps. First, as you're watching the snake, you think of the hardcore scientific information that you know about that snake. The second step is you use your imagination to the best of your limited ability to imagine what it's like to be that snake. That's empathy. He says only when you do both those things can you really ask the right scientific questions about the snake. In essence, you have to become the snake. Obviously, that's not a new idea. Indigenous people for a long time have said that and still do. I think we're coming around to that, some of us who forgot that. So this empathy, it opens up the world to us too. When you begin to really pay attention to other animals, whether it's your companion animal, which I write about in the book, or especially when it's the wild animals around us, when you really start to stop and connect and make that connection through the habitat of the heart, the whole world opens up.
Yeah.
It's even beyond a kind of mindfulness. It's really, it's like when you look into the eyes of some animals, it's like entering another universe.
Do you think it's forgetting that our modern life makes us forget these connections and we have to go back and relearn them? Or do you see it more like a process of unlearning? Or do you see it more like learning something for the first time? Like, I'm sure that we're all innately hardwired to have these deep connections, even though in our modern lives we might think that we can't access that potential. So what is it, the process that we have to embark on, do you think?
In Our Wild Calling, in the new book, I answer that question. It's a great question, but it's difficult to answer in human language. Probably the best way to answer that is to listen to and tell stories. This is very old. Our ancestors, they would come home from the forest and around the campfire, and then they would tell the stories of their animal encounters during the day or their encounters with nature. Sometimes they would act out. They would dance these stories. They would become the bear. Answering that question intellectually, it would give you only a partial answer. It's one of the reasons why I collected so many stories from all kinds of folks who live in cities, who are indigenous people, who are scientists as well, who tell these stories about their encounters with other animals or their relationships over time with them. And through these stories, I certainly began to understand not only what that is, what the habitat of the heart is, but how to get there.
I was I haven't read the book you've written about fishing, but I was really excited to find out that you had written a book about people who lived on the river and fishing communities, because I find people who live in these environments for their entire lives and who have a deep connection with something and a deep understanding of something that many others of us just would have no idea, like species of fish or the movements of the water. It's so inspiring, and this idea of like where story meets with lived experience and a whole other way of relating to the world. I love fish too, and water as an element. I grew up scuba diving, and I used to teach scuba diving, and now I free dive. And I was always really amazed when I was learning about the human biology and how it interacts with water, with like the mammalian dive reflex, where you put your face, as soon as you put your face in water, your mammalian dive reflex kicks in, like immediately your heart slows down, the blood starts to move more towards your core, and as you start diving down deeper, all these other reflexes kick in until so as the pressure increases, your airspace gets smaller, so there's more air is concentrated here. The blood goes from your extremities into the capillaries around your lungs, and then when you're very low on oxygen, your spleen starts to excrete more oxygenated blood into the bloodstream, so you can last longer before you lose all your oxygen. That was a really bad explanation, but just these incredible ways that we've always lived with and in nature, and you wouldn't have thought that we had this like distant memory from when we were more marine living.
So you were describing your inner fish, it sounds like.
No, but it's everybody has it. So
and you were describing a book that I wrote about 20 years ago, and it was called Fly Fishing for Sharks. And no, I don't advocate fishing for sharks. But what I did for that book is I traveled all over the United States, traveled all over America to spend time with all kinds of different cultures of fishing, to write about America, to write about Americans, and lots of stories in that book. And you know, in the new book, in Our Wild Calling, I do talk about people's connection to water as part of that. I mean, one of the issues is here that I've written about recently. I wrote a cover story in Sierra magazine for Sierra, the Sierra Club, about the human right to a connection to the natural world, something I've been talking about for about a decade. And there's a river in New Zealand where the Maori people, the people who live along the river, the indigenous people, have been instrumental in protecting what they say is that river's right to exist. And the intersection between the human right to a positive connection to nature, which I believe that this is essential to our physiology, it's essential to our soul. Anything that is essential to that, we have a human right to. That means that along with that right comes the responsibility to protect nature. So this river, they've made the successful argument, has the right to exist, and everything that lives in it has the right to exist. When you think about it, that connects very directly to the human right to it, because the people who live on that river depend on that river, depend on all the life in it for their own lives. Increasingly, I think we need to connect to the right of nature to exist with our own right to our connection to nature, and therefore our right to exist as well.
Yeah, the rights of nature argument is the wrong word, but it's a really inspiring idea. I think it's so far from the way our legal structure works right now, which is so ironic because companies have rights. Like a company is a person, but if you suggested that a river could be defended as a person, have personhood, it wouldn't be accepted in the courts of law, even though many people would accept the idea of it.
I think the times are changing. I think that's not too far ahead. I think it's possible. One of the things, particularly because so much of your audience is younger, and I have sons, they're now in their 30s, which just distresses me because they grew up so fast, but we talk about this a lot. I think that we, certainly in the United States, and I think in the urbanized world in particular, we have entered what I call the dystopian trance. We have become enraptured with despair, addicted to despair. And there are good reasons for that. There's a lot of bad news in the world. The problem is that when I ask people, particularly young people, but I ask this of lots of people, what are the images that pop into your head right now without thinking intellectually? What are the images that pop into your head about what the far future looks like? Always, the pictures that people describe to me in their head look a lot like Blade Runner or Mad Max. At best, the Hunger Games, at least there's a few trees. They're a dystopian view of the future, a post-apocalyptic view of the future. That's it. That's what people tend to think about immediately, instinctively, when they think about the far future. Now, some folks think about solar panels, they think about energy efficiency, but even that isn't enough. Martin Luther King demonstrated in many ways, that any movement, any culture that cannot paint a portrait, a picture of a world that people will want to go to, will fail. We've lost, many of us, our ability to paint a picture of a future we want to go to. We have to find that, because if we don't find those images, we will certainly end up with the images we can imagine. And so I think the great work of our generation, your generation, my generation, is to begin to paint those pictures of a future we want to go to. I think nature is woven into those pictures, has to be at the center of those pictures. Once you begin to think about it, it's not just energy efficiency, it's not just solar panels. That's part of it. It's cities that become gardens, cities that become engines, as I said earlier, of biodiversity, that incubate life, that fill us with health and protect the health of the children of all species, not only ours. You can begin to see that kind of city in your mind's eye, in your heart. I think when people begin to wake up in the morning thinking about that future, they get excited. They want to do that. They want to make that. Yeah. So
that's that I hadn't thought about that before. How when you say imagine, what do you see in your mind? And I also had these images of like, the Matrix, or really dystopian visions, and this idea of what you think you become. I really believe in that, and like this whole manifesting your reality. And
Yeah, I avoid the phrase "back to nature." Sometimes people say that my book stimulated a back to nature movement, and I never say that. I say forward to nature.
Yeah,
It's the future. It's the future, and it's a great future if we can begin to imagine it. And when I talk about hope, which is essential here, I don't mean blind hope. I mean imaginative hope. It's a big difference.
Yeah.
We have to imagine what we want. We have to imagine that future. That's the first step to actually getting that future. That's essential for any kind of hope. And I actually don't see any practical alternative to that kind of hope.
Yeah, and having a vision that you can go towards and a direction. Otherwise, you just protest something you don't want, but then you'll never get where you do want.
And the most important thing is not for people like me to preach to other people that you have to come up with a positive view. Otherwise you're just protesting and being negative. No, I don't. The protests are a step in that direction. But as we do that, we have to start collectively imagining a nature-centered future, a nature-rich future, nature-rich cities, nature-rich schools, nature-rich homes and neighborhoods, a nature-rich life. You start to think in that way, and the future can look pretty good.
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of people find that connection with nature, that nature-rich life, a very spiritual connection as well. Do you see the two as linked, spirituality?
Yeah. In fact, the latest with Our Wild Calling, Outside Magazine in the United States, which is a really great magazine in the United States, did a story about the book and about me. And it was a very positive story. I really liked the story, except it said that I was starting to sound a little new agey. Now, I grew up in Kansas. Anybody who knows me would find that funny. I'm about the last person they would consider new agey. I'm a journalist, and journalists inherently are not. But I guess I am becoming a little new agey because this book really is much more about the spirit than the earlier books were.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been an amazing conversation. And I just want to go back quickly to when you were talking about your student who found stability in nature, and I was talking about flexibility that those other writers had written about. It made me think about the word equanimity, because that's the mixture of the two almost. It's the ability to have stability even when everything's going wrong. And also perhaps it's a feeling that you do get when you're in nature.
I wanted to comment briefly, I will, on what you were talking about, your inner fish, about what happens to you when you were scuba diving. I thought that was wonderful and fascinating. One of the first stories in Our Wild Calling is about an oceanographer at Scripps Institution of Oceanography in San Diego. He's one of the most famous oceanographers among oceanographers in the world. And he tells a story about when he was a student at the University of Washington, being out collecting samples on the bottom of the ocean, the Pacific. And he was face down on the bottom of the ocean collecting, and it suddenly felt something really large. He sensed something really large come above him and stop. That's usually not a good feeling. And he looked up and he saw a big tentacle coming down. And he looked over here, saw another big tentacle coming down. Then he looked up and he said, risking anthropomorphism, it was one of those huge Pacific octopuses that had a 12-foot wingspan, and it was looking down at me, and it decided I was a clam, and it came down and got me. And it wrapped him up in its tentacles tight. And he says, people think that those tentacles, those arms are soft, anything but.
Oh, my word.
He couldn't budge them. Around that time, he realized he was running out of oxygen in his tank. And so with the last of his strength, he kicked off the bottom. He and the octopus, still attached, began to go up in a column of water toward the top. And as they went up, the octopus moved around his body with his tentacles. He could feel the razor-sharp beak coming around his neck until he was looking into the eye of the octopus. And at that point he said, and this is the theme that is in many of these stories, he said something happened. And he laughs when he tells this. He says, somehow I think we made our non-aggression pact. And right about then, they hit the top of the water. He and the octopus still around him, huge octopus. And he pulls off his mask, rips off his mask, gasping for air, looks down in the water. The octopus is still down there looking at him. They still have eye contact. And so the next thing is the best part of the story. What does he do? He puts his mask back on and he dives. As the octopus disappears into the darkness, he dives after it and swims down as far as he can. And then the octopus and he are doing a kind of a spiral down into the depths of the ocean. And finally, he came back up and the octopus disappeared. I said, why would you do that? Why would you chase this octopus back down? And he said, he didn't know. He said, I don't know. He said, what I do know is that I felt something spiritual then. And he's a hardcore scientist and he's embarrassed to use that word. And he said, I did not want those moments to end. That's the habitat of the heart. Mm-hmm. That's the thing that we feel if we pay attention when we have these other encounters. And I'm not saying they're safe encounters always. I'm not pretending to romanticize the gentleness of nature. But those moments, and you were describing the change that happened to you when you were scuba diving, when we pay attention, whole worlds open up to us, as they did to this oceanographer.
Yeah. And then, yeah, the whole world is there to explore as soon as you're open to it. It's like being in a natural environment. Everybody can be there. If you take that.
And to love.
Yeah.
And if you love it, if enough of us learn that, then it can be protected as well as ourselves as part of it.
Mm. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. So inspiring to talk to you, and I'm going to definitely buy your book.
Okay, good.
It was well paid.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.